The blood on the altar stone was still fresh when Thrain arrived at the sacred grove, 3 days too late to stop what his brother had done. 3 days of riding through frozen forests that seemed to close in around him like the jaws of some ancient wolf. The priests stood in a circle around the stone, their white robes stained with sacrifice, their faces turned toward him with expressions that mixed pity and condemnation in equal measure. His brother Astrid lay crumpled at the base of the altar, her small body broken by the fall from the cliff above, and Thrain fell to his knees in the snow, a sound tearing from his throat that was barely human. She had been 8 winters old, his only child, the light of his life since her mother had died bringing her into the world, and now she was gone, offered to the gods by his own brother in a desperate attempt to save their village from the famine that had gripped the land for 2 brutal years. Gunnar stood apart from the priests, his face gaunt and hollow, his eyes reflecting a madness that Thrain had never seen before, the kind of desperation that came from watching children starve while the gods remained silent. He had been Jarl of Frostvik for 15 winters, had led the village through raids and harsh winters and conflicts with neighboring clans, but nothing had prepared him for this, for the slow death of his people as the crops failed year after year and the hunting grew scarcer and the livestock withered despite every offering and prayer. The village elders had come to him in secret, had whispered about the old ways, about the sacrifices that their ancestors had made in times of greatest need, about how the gods demanded the most precious things to grant their favor. And Gunnar, driven mad by the weight of leadership and the sight of his people dying, had listened. Thrain had been away when it happened, 3 days' ride to the south trading furs with a Saxon merchant who had no interest in the religious customs of the north, who dealt in silver and goods and asked no questions about why a Viking warrior looked so haggard and desperate. He had been trying to get supplies, to find some way to feed his village through another winter, to save them without resorting to the darkness that he'd seen growing in his brother's eyes. When he'd returned to find Astrid missing, when the women had told him with tears streaming down their faces that Gunnar had taken her to the sacred grove, he had known with horrible certainty what his brother intended. He had ridden like a man possessed, had pushed his horse until it collapsed beneath him, and then continued on foot, driven by the desperate hope that he might arrive in time to stop this madness. But he was too late, had been too late from the moment he'd left the village, because Gunnar had planned this carefully, had waited until his brother was gone to perform the ritual that he knew Thrain would never permit. The high priest, old Valgard, who had served the gods for 40 winters and claimed to hear their voices in the wind, had supported Gunnar's decision, had told the Jarl that the gods were hungry, that only the sacrifice of something truly precious would turn their favor back toward Frostvik, that half measures and animal offerings were no longer enough. The blood of an innocent child, offered willingly by her father's brother who loved her as his own, would surely move the gods to mercy. Thrain looked up at his brother from where he knelt in the blood-stained snow, and the rage that filled him was like nothing he had ever known, a fury so complete it felt like fire in his veins, burning away everything else until only the desire for vengeance remained. "You killed her," he said, his voice flat and dead despite the inferno inside. "You took my daughter, my only child, and you murdered her for your superstitions and your fear. I trusted you, left her in your care, and you butchered her like an animal on this cursed stone." Gunnar's face contorted with anguish, tears streaming down his cheeks into his beard, his hands shaking as he reached toward his brother. "I had no choice, Thrain. The gods demanded it. The village is dying, our people are starving, and nothing else has worked. Every prayer, every offering, every sacrifice we've made has been met with silence. But this will save them. Her death will not be in vain. The gods will hear us now, will see that we are willing to give them everything, and they will lift the curse from our lands." "The gods," Thrain spat, rising to his feet with his hand moving to the sword at his belt. "Your gods are either deaf or cruel, and I want nothing more to do with them. You've broken every law that matters, violated every bond of family and trust, all for the promise of divine favor that may never come. Even if the crops grow tomorrow, even if the hunting improves and the livestock thrives, it changes nothing. You murdered a child, Gunnar. You murdered my child, and for that there is no forgiveness, no redemption, no peace between us ever again." The priests moved to intervene as Thrain drew his sword, but Gunnar raised a hand to stop them, some part of him perhaps understanding that this moment had been inevitable from the instant he'd pushed Astrid from the cliff. "If you kill me, you doom the village. I am the Jarl, the one who speaks to the gods on behalf of our people. Without me, they will have no guidance, no protection from the forces that threaten us." Thrain laughed, a sound empty of humor, hollow as a winter wind through dead trees. "The village is already doomed if this is what it takes to save it. Better we all starve with our honor intact than prosper through the blood of innocents. You've damned yourself, brother, and I want no part of whatever cursed future you've purchased with my daughter's life." He could have killed Gunnar then, could have driven his blade through his brother's heart and felt the satisfaction of immediate vengeance, but something stayed his hand, some last shred of the man he'd been before grief consumed everything. Instead, he turned to the priests, to old Valgard, who stood with his hands folded in his robes, his expression serene despite the horror he'd sanctioned. "I curse you all. I curse this grove and these stones, and every god you claim to serve. May you find no peace in this life or the next. May the gods you've fed with innocent blood turn their faces from you. May everything you've done here today bring only more suffering." Valgard's serenity cracked for just a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his weathered face. "You cannot curse what is sacred, Thrain. The gods have accepted the offering. Her spirit has already passed into their realm. What is done cannot be undone, and your rage changes nothing." "Then let my rage be a monument to what you've stolen," Thrain said, sheathing his sword because killing these men would bring Astrid no closer to life. "I'm leaving Frostvik. I will not stay in a village that sacrifices children. I will not live among people who think the gods demand such monstrous prices. And I will tell everyone I meet what happened here. Will make sure the world knows what Gunnar the Godless did in his desperation." He gathered Astrid's broken body in his arms, her weight so light it made his heart break anew, and he carried her away from that cursed place, away from the priests and his brother, and the altar stone that would forever be stained with her blood. The walk back to Frostvik took hours, his legs moving mechanically while his mind retreated into numbness, unable to fully process the enormity of what had happened. Villagers came out to meet him, saw what he carried, and their faces told him that most had known what Gunnar planned, had allowed it to happen, had chosen the possibility of survival over the life of one small girl. He buried Astrid on the hillside overlooking the fjord, in a spot where wildflowers grew in summer, and the views stretched for miles across the water. He dug the grave himself despite offers of help, needed the physical labor to keep the madness at bay, needed to do this one final thing for his daughter with his own hands. As he lowered her into the frozen earth, he spoke words he'd never said to the gods before, words of renunciation and rejection, cutting himself off from the divine powers that had allowed this to happen. The next morning, he packed what little he owned onto a horse and prepared to leave. Gunnar came to see him off, his face still ravaged by grief and guilt and the terrible weight of leadership that had driven him to such extremes. "Where will you go?" the Jarl asked, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Anywhere but here," Thrain replied, not looking at his brother, unable to bear the sight of him. "I'll find a place where the gods demand less terrible prices, where children are valued more than crops, where family means something more than potential sacrifice." "The famine will end," Gunnar said, a desperate edge to his voice. "You'll see, her death will not be meaningless. The gods will bless us, and when you hear of Frostvik's prosperity, you'll understand that it was necessary, that there was no other way." Thrain finally turned to look at his brother, and what Gunnar saw in his eyes made him take a step back. "If the famine ends tomorrow, if Frostvik becomes the richest village in all of Norway, it changes nothing. You will always be the man who killed my daughter. That is your legacy now, brother. That is what you've purchased with her blood. Live with it if you can." He rode away without looking back, leaving behind everything he'd known, every connection and memory and piece of his identity that was tied to that place. The village of Frostvik disappeared behind the hills, and with it went the last remnants of the man Thrain had been, the loyal brother, the devoted father, the warrior who'd fought for his people and believed in the gods and the rightness of the old ways. What rode away from that place was something harder and colder, a man carved from ice and grief, who trusted nothing and no one, who had learned that even family could become monstrous when fear and desperation took hold. He wandered for months, drifting from village to village, never staying long enough to form attachments or build connections. He hired himself out as a sword for coin, his skills in battle the only thing he had left to offer the world. He fought in petty conflicts between rival jarls, defended merchant caravans from bandits, took on any work that kept him moving and didn't require him to care about anything beyond immediate survival. The other mercenaries he traveled with learned not to ask about his past, learned to recognize the look in his eyes that said he was somewhere far away, trapped in memories that played out in endless repetition. Winter came, and with it news that filtered through the trade routes like poison through water. Frostvik had not been saved by Astrid's sacrifice. The famine had continued, grown worse if anything, and disease had come in the wake of hunger, decimating a population already weakened by starvation. Gunnar had led a desperate raid on a neighboring village, trying to steal food to save his people, and had been killed in the fighting, cut down by a farmer defending his family's stores. The village had collapsed in the aftermath, the survivors scattering to find refuge elsewhere, the longhouses standing empty and slowly falling into ruin. Valgard the priest had hanged himself from a tree in the sacred grove, unable to bear the weight of his failure, the knowledge that the gods had not answered despite the terrible price paid. When Thrain heard this news, he felt nothing. No satisfaction at Gunnar's death, no vindication at the failure of the sacrifice, not even grief at the destruction of the place he'd once called home. He had burned through all his capacity for emotion, had spent it in the months of wandering and fighting, and trying to outrun the ghost of his daughter who appeared in his dreams every night. Astrid would come to him while he slept, sometimes as she'd been in life, laughing and playing, sometimes as she'd looked on the altar stone, broken and bleeding, and she would ask him why he hadn't saved her, why he'd left her with his brother, why her death had meant nothing. He began drinking heavily, trying to drown the dreams in ale and mead, but it never worked for long. The alcohol would pull him under for a few hours of dreamless sleep, but eventually he'd wake and remember, and the weight would settle on his chest again, making each breath an effort. The other mercenaries avoided him when he was drunk, had learned that he became unpredictable, violent, looking for fights that might end with him finally finding the death he secretly craved, but was too much a coward to seek directly. It was during one of these drunken nights, in a tavern in a nameless coastal village, that he met the old woman who would change everything. She sat in the corner watching him with eyes that seemed to see through all his defenses, all his carefully maintained numbness, straight to the raw wound at his core. When he stumbled toward the door, intending to find a place to pass out, she stood and blocked his path, her frail body somehow immovable despite his size and strength. "You carry death with you like a cloak," she said, her voice surprisingly strong for someone so ancient. "It surrounds you, follows you, marks you as one who has lost everything and refuses to let go. But death is not your destiny, warrior. You have work yet to do before the gods claim you." He tried to push past her, had no interest in cryptic pronouncements from strange old women, but her hand on his chest stopped him cold, a strength in that touch that defied her apparent frailty. "The gods took my daughter," he slurred, the words bitter on his tongue. "They took her and gave nothing in return. I want nothing from them, and if they want something from me, they can rot." The old woman smiled, sad and knowing. "The gods did not take your daughter. A man did, a man driven mad by fear and false prophecy. The gods are not cruel, warrior, but neither are they kind. They simply are, vast and incomprehensible, and when mortals try to bargain with them using the currency of blood and pain, they often find the price they thought they were paying is not the one that gets collected." Something in her words penetrated the fog of alcohol and grief, made him actually look at her for the first time. Her eyes were strange, one blue and one green, and they held depths that suggested she knew far more than any mortal should. "Who are you?" he asked. "Someone who sees the threads of fate more clearly than most," she replied. "And I see yours, Thrain Eriksson, tangled and knotted but not yet cut. You think you want to die, think you're ready to join your daughter in whatever realm awaits the dead, but you're wrong. You want revenge, want justice, want someone or something to pay for what was taken from you, and until you find that, you will wander, hollow and broken, a ghost among the living. There is no justice, he said, the truth of it, like ash in his mouth. My brother is dead, the priest is dead, the village that allowed it to happen is destroyed. Everyone who could be held accountable has already paid with their lives, and it changes nothing. Astrid is still gone, and no amount of vengeance will bring her back. The old woman nodded slowly. True, the dead do not return, no matter how much the living might wish it. But perhaps you ask the wrong questions, seek the wrong kind of justice. Your daughter's death was meaningless, served no purpose, accomplished nothing. But what if her life could still matter? What if you could ensure that no other father suffers what you have suffered, that no other child is sacrificed to false promises and desperate gods? He stared at her, trying to understand what she was suggesting, his alcohol-soaked mind struggling to follow the thread of her logic. How? By killing every priest who preaches sacrifice, by burning every sacred grove in Norway. The old ways run deep, and I'm just one man with a sword and a grudge. The old ways run deep, she agreed, but they are not unchangeable. Ways are just patterns of behavior, habits that persist because no one questions them. What if you became the one who questions? What if you traveled from village to village, not as a mercenary, but as a voice of reason, telling your story, showing people what the old ways cost when taken to their extremes? Words can be more powerful than swords when aimed correctly. The idea seemed absurd at first, the notion that he could change anything, that his voice could matter in a world governed by tradition and the perceived demands of divine powers. But as the old woman continued talking, painting a picture of a different kind of vengeance, not blood for blood, but meaning created from meaninglessness, purpose forged from tragedy, something in him began to shift, some small ember of will flickering to life in the cold ashes of his grief. "Why do you care?" he asked. "Why tell me this? What does it matter to you whether I drink myself to death or find some higher purpose?" She smiled again, that same sad, knowing expression. "Because I too have lost a child to the old ways, have stood where you stand now, and made the choice between destruction and creation. I chose creation, chose to use my pain to light the way for others, and it has given me years beyond what despair would have allowed. I offer you the same choice, warrior. Use your grief as a weapon against the forces that created it, or let it consume you. Either way you will die eventually, but one path leads to a death that means something." She left him then, disappeared into the night before he could ask more questions, and he was left standing in the cold with her words echoing in his mind. He returned to his room at the tavern and lay awake until dawn, thinking about what she'd said, about the possibility that Astrid's death could still serve a purpose, even if the gods had ignored her sacrifice. By the time the sun rose, he had made a decision. He spent the next weeks traveling to villages throughout the region, requesting permission to speak at their assemblies, telling the story of what had happened at Frostvik. He described Gunnar's desperation, the priest's false promises, the sacrifice of an innocent child, and the complete failure of the gods to respond. He spoke of the village's destruction, the pointless deaths that had followed, the way fear and superstition had led good people to support monstrous acts. His words were raw and powerful, carrying the weight of genuine grief and hard-won wisdom, and people listened. Not everyone agreed with him. Many priests denounced him as a blasphemer, claimed he was lying or exaggerating, insisted that the gods did demand sacrifice in times of great need. But others, particularly parents who looked at their own children and imagined them on an altar stone, began to question. Debates erupted in halls and around fires, arguments about the nature of divine will and the limits of what should be offered in the gods' names. Thrain didn't claim to have all the answers, didn't position himself as some kind of prophet with a new truth to replace the old ways. He simply told his story and let people draw their own conclusions, trusting that enough of them would choose to protect their children rather than sacrifice them. The work was hard and often discouraging. For every village that listened, another drove him away with threats and curses. For every father who thanked him for giving voice to doubts he'd been afraid to express, a priest condemned him as a servant of chaos, trying to undermine the divine order. But gradually, slowly, he began to see changes. Villages that had once performed blood sacrifices in times of crisis began exploring other options first. Priests who had wielded absolute authority began facing questions from their congregations. The old ways didn't disappear. They were too deeply rooted for that, but they began to bend, to evolve, to accommodate new ideas about what the gods actually wanted. Years passed, and Thrain transformed from a grief-stricken warrior into something like a wandering philosopher, known throughout Norway as the man who had lost his daughter to the old ways and chosen to fight them with words rather than swords. His hair went grey, his face became lined with the marks of hard-won wisdom, and though the pain of Astrid's death never fully left him, it became something he could carry rather than something that carried him. He never remarried, never had other children, remained devoted to the memory of the daughter whose death had become his life's purpose. He heard news occasionally of other villages that had faced famine or disaster and chosen different paths, had found ways to honor the gods without sacrificing their children, had survived through cooperation and innovation rather than blood magic. Each such story felt like a small victory, like proof that Astrid's death hadn't been completely meaningless, that some good had come from the worst moment of his life. It wasn't redemption exactly. Nothing could redeem what had been done to her, but it was something, a way of ensuring that her brief life had left a mark on the world beyond the trauma of its ending. One spring, nearly 20 years after he'd left Frostvik, Thrain's wanderings brought him back to the region where his old village had stood. He hadn't intended to return, had actively avoided the area for 2 decades, but his path had taken him there almost without conscious decision, as if some part of him needed to face what had been left behind. The village itself was gone, the longhouses collapsed into ruin, the streets overgrown with weeds and young trees. Nature had reclaimed what the gods and men had abandoned, turning a place of community and tragedy into just another clearing in the endless forest. He made his way to the sacred grove, to the place where his daughter had died, and found it changed almost beyond recognition. The altar stone was still there, weathered and stained, but the trees around it had grown wild, their branches creating a canopy that filtered the light into something soft and green. Someone had planted flowers around the base of the stone, wild flowers like the ones that grew on Astrid's grave, like the ones she'd loved to pick when she was alive, and though he had no idea who had done it or why, the gesture moved him nearly to tears. He sat beside the stone for hours, talking to his daughter the way he had when she was alive, telling her about the years since her death, about the villages he'd visited and the people he'd helped, and the small ways he'd tried to make her loss mean something. He told her about the children who'd been spared because fathers had heard his story and chosen differently, about the priests who'd modified their practices, about the slow shift in how people thought about sacrifice and divine will. He told her he was tired, that the years of wandering and fighting and trying to change the world had worn him down, that he felt the weight of his age and wondered how much longer he could continue. As he spoke, the wind picked up, rustling through the trees with a sound that was almost like laughter, like the bright, joyful sound Astrid had made when she was happy. It was probably nothing, just the random movement of air through leaves, but Thrain chose to believe it was something more, some sign that she heard him, that she approved of what he'd done with the years since her death, that she forgave him for not being there to save her. The rational part of his mind knew this was likely just wishful thinking, projection of his own needs onto natural phenomena, but after years of rejecting the gods and divine intervention, he allowed himself this one small moment of faith. When he finally stood to leave the grove, his legs stiff from sitting so long, he felt something shift inside him, some burden he'd been carrying beginning to ease. The grief would never fully leave him. He would carry Astrid with him until the day he died, but perhaps it no longer needed to define him completely, to consume every moment and thought. Perhaps he could honor her memory, while also allowing himself moments of peace, even happiness, without feeling like he was betraying her by moving forward with his life. He returned to his wandering, but with a different energy now, less driven by desperate need to outrun pain, and more motivated by genuine desire to help, to share what he'd learned, to be useful in whatever time remained to him. He began training younger men and women who wanted to carry on his work, who'd heard his story and felt called to question the old ways in their own communities. He taught them not to be confrontational or aggressive, but to ask questions, to tell stories, to help people think critically about traditions they'd always accepted, without examination. One of his students was a young woman named Ragnar, whose brother had nearly been sacrificed during a drought before the village elders had remembered Thrain's words and chosen a different path. She had a gift for speaking that exceeded even his own, a way of making people feel heard and understood even as she challenged their assumptions. Watching her work, seeing how effectively she could reach people he'd never been able to convince, Thrain felt something like hope for the first time in decades. The work would continue after he was gone, would outlive him, and perhaps even outlive the memory of why it had started, and that was as close to immortality as any mortal could hope for. His health began failing when he reached his 60th winter, his body finally succumbing to the decades of hard travel and harder living. He settled in a small village on the coast, too weak to continue wandering, and Ragnar came to care for him, along with several of his other students who'd spread throughout Norway carrying his message. They gathered around him in his final days, and he told them stories of Astrid, wanting them to know her not as a symbol or a catalyst for change, but as a real child who'd loved flowers and hated spinach and laughed at her father's terrible jokes. On his last night, as fever burned through him and he drifted between consciousness and delirium, Thrain dreamed of his daughter one final time. But this time she wasn't broken or bleeding, wasn't asking why he hadn't saved her. Instead she was whole and healthy, 8 years old and smiling, reaching for his hand the way she used to when she wanted to show him something interesting. She led him through a meadow filled with wildflowers, toward a light that was warm and welcoming, and though he knew he was dying, knew he was leaving behind the students and the work and everything he'd built, he felt no fear, no regret, only a profound sense of peace. "Did I do enough?" he asked her in the dream, the question that had haunted him for 20 years finally voiced. "Did I make your death mean something?" She looked up at him with those eyes that were so like her mother's, wise beyond their apparent years. "You made my life mean something, Papa. You remembered me not as a sacrifice or a tragedy, but as a person, as your daughter who you loved. And you used that love to help others, to save children you would never meet, to make the world a little bit better. That's more than enough. That's everything." He died before dawn, peacefully, with his students around him and a smile on his weathered face. They buried him on a hillside overlooking the sea, in a spot where wildflowers would grow in summer, and they carved a stone that bore not his name and deeds, but simply, "He turned grief into purpose, and in doing so found peace." Beside his grave they planted another marker, this one for Astrid, so that father and daughter could rest together at last, separated in life but united in death, and in the legacy they'd created together. Ragnar and the others continued the work, spreading throughout Scandinavia and beyond, questioning practices that caused unnecessary suffering, helping communities find ways to honor their traditions while protecting their most vulnerable. The movement that Thrain had started from the ashes of his worst tragedy grew and evolved, changing forms but keeping its essential purpose, ensuring that no parent would have to experience what he had experienced, that no child would be sacrificed to false promises and desperate faith. And though the world never became perfect, though the old ways never completely disappeared, they bent a little more toward mercy, toward reason, toward the protection of the innocent. It was a small victory in the grand scheme of things, a tiny light against the vast darkness of human cruelty and divine indifference, but it was enough, more than enough, everything that Thrain's broken heart had needed to find its way back to something like wholeness before the end.